you wait. So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this special leadership development in EDI training. My name is Deborah Gerard, FAIA. I am a former AIA California president and chair of the EDI committee, and so I will be the moderator for today's session. So just a few quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. Please mute yourself when you're not participating in the discussion to avoid any background noise. And we ask that you use the Q&A feature and not the chat box to ask any questions for today's presenter. With the Q&A feature, attendees can like a question to move it to the top of the list. Questions will be answered during the Q&A portion towards the end of the presentation, but we'll also be kind of keeping an eye on it. So if there's anything very relevant to the moment of the conversation, we'll go ahead and interrupt Mary-Margaret and ask it. And I'm getting ahead of myself because you don't know Mary-Margaret yet. This session qualifies for 2 AIA learning units for those who are watching live. AIA California staff will report those units for you once you've finished the session, so stick around to the end. We are recording today's session for those who are not able to attend, and as always, all webinar content and additional resources will be available on the AIA California website shortly after the session ends. So now let's get started, and let me introduce our presenter. Mary-Margaret Zindren is the Executive Vice President of AIA Minnesota, sorry about that, Vice President of AIA Minnesota, the state's 3 local AIA chapters, and the Minnesota Architectural Foundation. For more than 30 years, Mary-Margaret has worked to further the common good through the collective efforts of communities and professionals with experience leading associations related to city government, the law, and the profession of architecture. She's a frequent facilitator, moderator, panelist, and keynote speaker on organizational leadership, culture change, and racial and gender equity. Plus, she's a really nice person. So we're very honored to have her with us to lead this session on how we as leaders in the AIA can be a catalyst in moving the profession and our organization forward. So with that, Mary-Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and it's so good to see you again. I remember when you all visited Minnesota before everything shut down, and I wish I was there in person with you again someday. All right, I'm going to...
And guys, it's 20 degrees where she is. I was complaining about it being cold, so let's just put that in perspective.
All right. Okay, so thank you all again for inviting me to be part of what I understand is your annual leadership training for leaders across AIA California and the components throughout California. I'm going to start off with a question for y'all to think about. And it may be part of why you were excited to come to this session today. It may be a question that you've not thought about much before. I'm actually going to just give you a couple of minutes to think about these questions and jot down a few notes for yourself. And then we'll just invite a few of you to share some of your answers. It gives me a little bit of context for where you all are. And I think sort of grounds us in this work. It grounds you in your intentions coming into this session. So the question is, where have you had success and where have you struggled when it comes to leading on EDI? And you can answer this question in the context of leading in your firm, in the context of the built environment, or in your AI component. And again, I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to gather your thoughts on this.
And anyone who wants to share, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So Mary-Margaret, are you ready for us to?
I
begin?
am, yeah.
Okay.
Would love to hear
And-
from a few folks.
And Karina, did you want to unmute yourself in chat? Is Karina able to unmute herself in chat? Yes, she is.
Okay, I can now. So yeah, it's interesting. I just this week had some challenges. I lead an equity initiative in our firm, and we have some really great ongoing monthly programming and discussions. There's a lot of like grassroots energy. When it comes to making meaningful changes in the leadership group, there's a lot of agreeing in dialogue. But when it comes to, making some space for other people to take responsibility of things, enabling and empowering others, seems very difficult, almost impossible to nudge those changes. So there's some work that can happen at the lower levels of organization, but there's a lot of struggle, and it with that upper level change, and it's always an example, right? So how, it's like, how do you continue to keep the momentum going and people excited about more equity when the sort of top of the organization stays pretty static?
Yep. That's very helpful context, and we'll, I think when we talk about leadership theory and modern leadership theory, I think this is going to resonate with you in that context. Great.
Thank you.
All right, Cash Upton.
Great. Hey, everyone, thanks. As well as being on the AIA Santa Barbara board, I'm also the president of the Central Coast Green Building Council. And, we've really been trying to bring the access to sustainable and healthy built environments to communities that are often overlooked. So it's been a little bit of a struggle because, in the past, sustainable construction has been more expensive. So trying to bridge that gap of accessibility.
Yeah, I empathize with that struggle when we talk a little bit about equity in the built environment, which is going to be less of a focus in today's conversation, but is something that we've been working on for a long time, but especially after the murder of George Floyd and the unrest, trying to cultivate the best of what's possible in the built environment in these areas. We've run up against a duality that is very frustrating, where policymakers are pushing for affordable housing and in other realms pushing for climate action, but not able to see those as coming together and necessary to be one and the same, right?
Mm-hmm. We just had a webinar from Cal Earth Institute, whose mission is, to build super Adobe structures. So we've also been trying to, work with jurisdictions to make alternative building materials that are, less expensive than, very manufactured materials to be more accessible in the building code as well.
Great. Okay, thank you.
All right, Amy Elliott, and I don't know how many.
We'll just take one more and then
right.
Thank you.
All right, Amy, you're up.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
You can.
Okay, good. Usually there's a thing on the bottom of the screen. There wasn't, so this is great. So back to an earlier question, I just was on something this morning talking about this very same thing. There definitely seems to be a kind of like over the Rubicon aspect of younger staff in particular, where they're absolutely ready and willing to not only have the conversation, but be present and be seen in the conversation, i.e. not be anonymous. Whereas the opposite tends to be true. And I'm in a very traditional firm, relatively speaking. And it just seems like the Rubicon that is really difficult, frankly, to cross over for leadership. We're making progress, but there's a little bit of the feeling, well, if it's not broken, why do we have to fix it?
Yeah.
Which just seems like, 180 degrees from what's really going on out there. So,
yep. Well, and I think there are some tactical ways in to open up specific conversations that we'll touch on today. So I'll keep your comments in mind as we move through. So thank you all. Appreciate it. Okay. So I'm going to start off in just grounding us in leadership theory. And I will just admit that this is an area of long-standing interest and attention for me. My master's degree is in public and nonprofit leadership. And I have built and led leadership development programs across several associations over the years. So this is some of what I share with our Leadership Forum program each year to kick them off. So the first is to understand that leadership theory is ever evolving. The leadership theories that drove how people thought about what it meant to be a good leader, whether leaders were born or made, really sort of started off focused on what's called the great man theory. And yes, gendered terminology at the time, that was really about celebrating individual leaders, the hero leader, in order to understand what made them tick, what were their particular traits or characteristics, with the idea that you could emulate an individual leader and become great yourself. It tended to be role-based, positional leadership, lifted up, authoritative in nature, directive in nature, and very hierarchical. And so that's one side of the continuum. Where we are today with leadership theory, really what's sort of taken hold over the last 10 years is more skill and aptitude and action-based, in particular, transformational leadership theory and adaptive leadership theory. It's very focused on integrative approaches and inclusive approaches. And I'm going to delve a little bit into transformational leadership theory, and then we'll go a deeper dive into adaptive leadership. So my next question for you is going to ask you to take a look at a graphic that's going to be on the next slide. And I'm going to ask you to pick one of the categories and identify where your component falls along the continuum between traditional and transformational leadership. And then I'll ask you to do the same in the context of your firm or your organization. This is an exercise that after this session, I encourage you to do sort of across all of the categories, but for purposes of today's presentation, just pick one. So hopefully, I know this graphic is a little bit fuzzy. It was a lot to try to think about recreating it. So I hope you're able to read it and see. But the categories are organization and work and business environment, how and why people work, organization structure and function, role and approach to leadership, communication, strategy and planning, and values. So pick one of those categories. And again, sort of think about where your component, where your firm or employer falls along a continuum between the left side, the traditional leadership theory, and the right side, transformational leadership theory. And I'll give you just a couple minutes to think about that and jot down some notes for yourself. Just give you another 30 seconds to jot down your current thought. Okay. So I'd love to hear from just a few of you about what your takeaway was when you dug into this question. And then also to think about how did you know? What informed where you placed your organization, your component, your firm or employer along those continuums? What were the signs and signifiers of where it falls along that continuum? So if you're game to share your thinking, go ahead and raise your hand.
I see Sarah Vasquez typing, so I'm
Okay.
gonna ask,
Okay.
I'm gonna suggest, if you're a game, just unmute yourself and save your fingers.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll jump in. I love this chart. It really made me think, actually. I would say about 2 years ago, we were really on the traditional side, almost top to bottom, but it's been a, chaos is good, disaster can be productive scenario since then. And we're moving more fundamentally toward the transformational model,
Can I
particularly
ask which organization you're talking about when you say we?
Oh, my firm, Dreyfus and Blackford,
Got it. Okay.
about a 42-person firm.
Got it.
So the how and why people work, I think, is the biggest transformational part of it, which is not surprising given COVID, et cetera. I think the hardest part is the strategy and planning and the organization structure and function. Those are maybe 20% into transformation, still a little locked into tradition. And then some residual statements here that kind of click on the traditional side of the fence. There's still parts of that like paying your dues, which is my least favorite statement in the world. But on the other hand, younger, newer leadership rising up are really pushing a lot of the things on the transformational side.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Jeff Johnson?
Yeah, this is a great chart. I think it's always kind of in transit, that I think we're all moving from the traditional, the old school boss with the iron hammer, had its day and had been effective. But I think what I'm finding as I mature as a leader is this idea of servant leadership, where how do I serve the people that serve my clients or our clients to do their job better? And it's a completely different mindset. So that how do I equip them to be more effective? And the old school where you'd had to prod from behind, how do you do the reverse by leading them forward? And so a big part of that is demonstration. So if I'm not effective in these areas on that right side, how are they going to know what that looks like? So the whole idea of the motivation of the work is how can, I understand, or do I take the time to understand kind of where they are and where they're trying to go? So it takes a little bit more, I would say, intentionality to find where their passions and their capacities are so that they can achieve their goals, which ultimately unlocks their passions, and they just set them off in a direction and we just equip them. When it happens, it's amazing. They just light up, they're on fire, they're more effective, they're more productive, more profitable, and they're a better value to the company. And but until you have that intentional approach, you might not see it. and you think you have to bring the hammer. So I think there's just a mindset that needs to shift.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that the way that you just talked about this was very much in the first person about you individually and what you've been trying to do in your leadership, what you've observed as you've embraced servant leadership. Individual and organizational self-awareness about where you're at and what you're aiming for is really important to leadership overall, but particularly important in the context of leadership around equity, diversity, and inclusion, justice in the built environment. I'm going to move on to the next couple of slides here, and we're going to delve deeper into a particular leadership theory called adaptive leadership. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Heifetz and Linsky. The way that they define adaptive leadership is being able to take on the gradual but meaningful process of adaptation, diagnosing the essential from the expendable, and bringing about a real challenge to the status quo. At its core, adaptive leadership is about being able to anticipate challenges and identify their root causes. It relates to being open to feedback, positioning yourself, again, individually and as an organization, to be ready for inevitable change, nimbleness, adeptness in shifting direction quickly and well, and the ability to embrace ambiguity. The idea that not knowing is more than okay, it is expected. And I think this is one that I've observed to be, in some ways, more challenging than I expected it to be for architects and architectural designers. Understanding that you're working in a context of a future that is unknown, it's inherently ambiguous. And yet, architecture students are often taught to assert their knowledge with tremendous confidence. To not be ambiguous about what they're bringing forward. And so there's, again, a duality there that's curious to me, and I think can sometimes get in the way of adaptive leadership. Another way to think about adaptive leadership is in terms of the types of challenges that you face as a leader. There's the realm of technical challenges, which can be addressed with a one-time, easily defined solution. This is the checklist approach to leading and addressing issues. Adaptive challenges have no clear answer. They take time to address, and they may require cultural shifts within organizations and industries and societies. They typically occur when an organization is in transition. And what's true is that today's challenges tend to be more in the realm of adaptive than technical in nature. One of the things that I have dealt with, I have fielded from day one in working in architecture. I've been with AIA Minnesota for 7.5 years now, is folks wanting the checklist for how to create culture change, how to transform their firm into being one that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And it's not checklist kind of work. It is essentially inherently adaptive work. So that's hard for folks to get their heads around. And yet, I think when we really try to discern what is the difference between a technical and an adaptive challenge, it's very clear that work around EDI is adaptive work. This idea, this theory has been around for a while. This article back in 2012 that was published in Fast Company was one that when it came out, I was so excited about it. I bought extra copies, shared them with everybody I knew in the organization I was with at the time, because it was a leadership theory that was cross-cutting across generations, which I appreciated because leadership theory to that point had been very much assigned to, silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, that they had their particular ways of leading and things that they resonated with. And this idea of generation flux was very sort of intertwined with adaptive leadership theory. And it was the idea of leaders who thrive in these ambiguous climates that require new approaches, mindsets that embrace instability, and that tolerate and even enjoy recalibrating careers, business models, and assumptions. So that is how I'm wired. That is how I work to lead. And it's what has proven to be very helpful to our work at AIA Minnesota in leading change in the culture of the organization and how we operate. One thing that's also true about adaptive challenges is that they can't be solved well, and they can't be dictated by those just at the top of a hierarchical chart. They are found in the collective intelligence of people at all levels. It is collaborative work to both define and address adaptive challenges. And this means that you can lead from wherever you are in an organization, with or without formal authority. It is work that is about confronting challenges, adjusting values, changing perspectives, and learning new habits. Some of the traits of adaptive leaders flow very easily from what I've just mentioned. They are folks who challenge the way that things have always been done. They are flexible and accept change as part of the work. They embrace uncertainty, learn from it, and use it. They are proactive and open to experimentation, and they welcome, seek out, and cultivate a diversity of viewpoints. Again, in this area of not relying on knowing, adaptive leaders succeed by raising core questions, surfacing rather than running from conflict, challenging long-held beliefs, and I love this way of phrasing it, bringing people into the sometimes painful space of uncertainty. I also think that this particular way of thinking about adaptive leadership is really powerful and reinforces the idea that anyone can lead from where they are. The adaptive demands of our time require leaders who take responsibility without waiting for revelation or request. One can lead with no more than a question in hand. I really do believe the key to leading, and in particular leading in the context of EDI, is to ask better questions, ask questions in a way that is truly from a place of interest and curiosity and integrity, and be open to what you hear, be curious about what you hear in response. The other thing about good questions is that they are a powerful antidote to hubris. They can be the bedrock of change and creativity. And I think this is also a really important concept, that asking good questions trades control for contribution. And the higher you are in a structure in terms of positional power, the more that adaptive leaders embrace the idea of asking questions rather than putting forward directives. So where I see the intersections of modern leadership theory, both transformational leadership and adaptive leadership and EDI, is in the realms of the work being rooted in trust and respect, that there's an orientation toward deeper purpose and mission, that there is value placed on diversity of perspectives and embracing of change, Also embracing of experimentation and good risks, good trouble, and that fundamental idea of adaptation. So I'm going to ask a question of you all again, sort of beyond seeing attention to EDI as integral to modern leadership theory in any context. Why is EDI a leadership imperative in architecture? What comes to mind for you when I bring forward that question? And again, just go ahead and raise your hand and Deborah will help me out.
Hi.
Rachel Adams.
Yeah, Rachel Adams here in Pasadena. I would just say, it's probably been said before already multiple times, but to design for our community, we have to represent our community. And to represent our community, we have to lead in that aspect as well. And so.
Yep. Representation matters. Having the demographics, the perspectives, the life experiences of the communities that you're designing for and working with in some way reflected within the team makes everything move at a speed of trust that is easier to achieve, easier to fuel, and results in those design outcomes that everyone's working toward. Other thought?
Ginger?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, that was tricky. Yes, absolutely what you just said as far as communities, but then the second part I think is we're responsible for creating spaces that are going to last a long time, which assumes that there's going to be changes that, like you had said, we have no control over or no knowledge of. Yeah. So ensuring that as we're creating these designs that we're pulling in as many perspectives and backgrounds and potentials to think about all the options in the future and to take those into account instead of just a single-minded.
Good. Yeah. Winston. Oh, I'm sorry, Winston Thorne. Yeah, you figured out who you were. There are two Winstons.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think what comes to my mind is being part of that visible minority narrative is identification. How do you identify? And when individuals are asking you the question, even in this form to some capacity, the whole term is, well, you know what I mean? Well, I don't know what you mean because I'm not part of your cultural relevance. You're looking always from the inside out, and I'm looking always from the outside in. So when we talk about EDI and leadership, I guess the easiest litmus test is to look at all the CEOs and CFOs in every organization you see right now in most chapters or most firms and see if that actually identifies with the people working in those offices. And does that also identify with the cities in which those offices serve?
Yeah. Excellent. That idea of, you know what I mean? It's such a perfect encapsulation. And I think about the work that we've done in community, the work that I know our members routinely do in community, and it's the music underneath the words. It's the follow-up question that's asked based on the particular intonation or the particular turn of phrase that if you're not of a community, you may not pick up on and may not get the depth and breadth of perspective that you otherwise would. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that forward.
Do you want more?
Okay, one more, yes, and then we'll move on.
Okay, Amy Elliott.
This is great, by the way. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Following up on a couple people's comments, I love that. I put it down, assumptions around agreement, which is kind of backward looking. My really large issue here is the idea that and it's tied up with our value, that we seem as a profession to be hung up on validating our value. But unfortunately, it's kind of a backward looking way of thinking about that versus a forward thinking way, which goes to the issue of, designing for the future, designing for those, who aren't even born yet and who don't look like us and don't validate ourselves, validate the profession in the way that we have thought about that. My generation has done a little too much telling and not enough asking. And I really think that younger practitioners, emerging practitioners are much more interested in asking.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. And one of the comments I hear most often from architects and designers of color about people who are more dominant in the profession, white professionals, is that they don't know how to listen. And I know that our members sort of across the board think that they're listening, think that they're good at it. And to recognize that it's almost like the platinum rule, right? And it's similar to trust and respect, that someone feeling heard, someone being heard is really about where they're at as opposed to where you're at. And getting better at listening, deep listening, is a trainable skill. One of the things that I was so grateful I sort of stumbled into when I was in my master's program was a community organizing course. And I was in there with undergrads. And so the age range was from, 19 to, 45 or 50. And we did one-to-ones. And if you've never done a one-to-one, it is an exercise that community organizers use to very quickly understand where someone else is coming from. And just to briefly summarize it, it's the idea that so often when we're in conversation with other people, someone will say something and we will respond in a way that brings it actually back to ourselves. So when someone tells a story, you respond to saying, oh, I had something like that happen to me too. And you think you're being empathetic, and in a way you are, but what's happening in that moment is that you're keeping the conversation here as opposed to following up with a question that dives deeper and exhibits curiosity and genuinely helps you, grow depth of understanding again very quickly. We're often in a mode of two-way monologues as opposed to truly seeking to listen and to understand and be present with someone else. So one of the other things I think is also really useful in this context is the realm of mindfulness, focus on presence, and really being open to what you're hearing and delving deeper. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but I just really appreciated that comment. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next sort of block of content. And this one I think is going to be a little bit longer, so bear with me. So one of the things that we know is true from significant research, and it's often phrased in a way that's a little truncated, but it's that diverse teams perform better. That's what we usually hear. What's true from the research is that diverse teams, when well managed or when working well together, perform better. So this graphic is actually from the Guides for Equitable Practice and the first chapter of those guides. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later, but that first chapter is focused on intercultural development and those skills. And the sort of space between having diverse representation on a team and there being equity and high performance within the team is this idea of intercultural development and the ability to bridge across difference and adapt toward each other. And in particular, for people of dominant culture to adapt toward people who are less represented and have historically been marginalized. So a couple of things here we've already mentioned, in particular around work that needs to be resonant. If it's not, the market will shift to recognize that. Where I've seen this happen is in the context of quote unquote community engagement. Architects and designers are not necessarily well regarded in community circles as being good at this. There are others who have developed a variety of approaches and methods that do seem to get more traction within community. So we need to be challenging those traditional approaches, and whether it's partnering with folks who are well respected and successful in drawing out and connecting with community, and learn from them. It's important to the resonance of the process and the outcome. And then, of course, what has been unsaid, but we know is true, is the severe lack of racial and gender representation that's out of sync with demographic change. And I'm sorry, that has been mentioned by some of the earlier commentators. And I want to note, this is not just about the community at large and the users or potential users, it's also about decision makers. The shifts that are happening in terms of who the CEOs are, who the heads of educational institutions and nonprofits, that is shifting very substantially. And if you are not able to connect well with, to have a representative team when you are vying for a project that, for an organization that is led by people of color and people who have been underrepresented, you may be less likely to be successful in that bid for work. So this relates to the overall business case. And in some of the research we've done, we sort of boiled it down to firms being best positioned for success when their demographics reflect the population of their geography. And whether or not that is true, they also have partnerships that strengthen that representation. So they recognize that they may not be able to achieve that full demographic representation in the particular geography that they're serving, where a project is, but they can partner to strengthen that. As I mentioned, intercultural competence and collaboration skills, a focus on flexible outcomes-based approaches, and then the being skilled in climate-oriented and equitable design approaches and the intersection of the two. The other thing I want to note is that creating a culture of trust, respect, belonging, and agency is critical to those diverse teams performing well, and it affects both individual satisfaction and business outcomes. There was a really great study done in 2019 that was brought forward in the Harvard Business Review that focused on the benefits of a culture of belonging and the specific benefits of having a sense of belonging that accrue to an individual. So the research showed a 56% increase in job performance among people who had a strong sense of belonging in their workplace, a 50% drop in turnover risk, a 75% reduction in sick days, and a 167% increase in their willingness to recommend their company to others. In the context of shortages in the workforce of architects that have that sweet spot of 10 years of work experience that I know many firms look for, This particular factor is incredibly important. And then from an individual benefit perspective, to realize that those with a high sense of belonging received double the raises and 18 times more promotions. So when you flip that then and think about who most often does not have a high sense of belonging, those tend to be people who are not of the dominant culture of architecture. So they are they're half as likely to get raises or I'm trying to flip this into this statistic around, but you understand that they are going to receive raises that are less lucrative, less beneficial, and less likely to be promoted. I also want to just turn this in the context of associations. So if you have a strong sense of belonging within an association, your job performance as a volunteer leader is likely to be stronger. You are less likely to step away from engagement in the organization and volunteer service. You're more likely to show up, and you are more likely to recommend engagement in the component, in the association, to others in your network. We've seen the power of this at AIA Minnesota as we've undergone our culture change. What's true about recruiting for volunteer leaders remains true, or it has been true over time, that it is very much about people individually recruiting people from their own networks. We are very transparent now in promoting opportunities, but at the end of the day, folks most often step forward when they are asked by someone they know to think about an opportunity. So again, this culture of belonging shows up in a lot of different ways and is really critical. So the last thing I want to mention here is in terms of why EDI is a leadership imperative in architecture is fundamentally because we work with and for people. And because of this, we need to know the people we serve. We need to know their aspirations, their struggles. We need to know their stories. And every time that we see statistics related to architecture and underrepresentation and bias in architecture, there are personal stories behind them. I'm just going to spend a few minutes briefly bringing forward an incredible resource from AIA that I hope you've all seen. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to spend real time with this report. The Center for Work-Life Law, based in California, is one of the best it is the best in the country, has been for decades in terms of Joan C. Williams' work. She has been studying bias in professions for many years. She has done so in the fields of law and academia and engineering, and now most recently in collaboration with AIA architecture. And what the Center for Work-Life Law found, of course, is that there are a variety of bias patterns that show up in architecture, with white men tending to report better experiences than white women, men of color, and women of color. These differences are profound. I'm going to walk through just a few of these. The preponderance of women and women of color who are regularly interrupted and lead to people feeling silenced. It's very, very prevalent. The idea that women, Black women in particular, Latina women in particular, and multiracial women in particular, are called on their appearance or their demeanor in ways that white men are not. The idea that one's accomplishments are due to luck. This is something that Black men and Black women and Native American women tend to experience much more regularly than white men or white women. The idea that one's success is a surprise, and the kind of comments along these lines. I just witnessed this happen at an event in the past 6 months. And to witness someone go through that conversation was incredibly painful. And they're still contemplating how they want to follow up with that situation. Questions addressed to someone else. This is the realm of underrepresented people being in the room and not being assumed to be the architect in the room, not being assumed to be the project manager, being mistaken for administrative or custodial staff. And just a few of these experiences brought forward in this report. I've experienced too many incidences of sexism to count or share within a small text box while in architecture. And I've been planning on leaving the profession for some time for primarily this reason. I took leave after having a child, and when I returned, there was no longer meaningful work for me at the firm. I've been told I should be a housewife. My direct supervisor saying, "That sounds like something a woman would do," during my review when I mentioned that I wrote down a list categorizing my priorities. I've had clients refer all their questions to my 20-something male intern when I was a 40-something owner of my company. Even as a seasoned 30-year professional, when I am with a male, even a much younger male colleague, often clients and other professionals will address questions and remarks to the male instead of me. I've experienced behavior that is unbecoming, like being patted on my head by my CEO. I was sitting down. It was in a public place, and I was just mortified. So Ivanu Love Stanley, back in 2014, as part of her speech in receiving the AIA Whitney Young Award, put it this way: is this profession what you really want it to be? So I'm going to come back to that for just a moment. One of the things that's true about my work, and I'm sure this is true for Nikki as well, and all of you who are component executives, is that you carry the stories of your members with you. The number of stories that I hold from members who have been deeply disrespected, deeply hurt by their experiences in this profession over and over again, is perhaps the most motivating factor for me. I can look at the broad statistics about lack of representation. I can be compelled by the importance of equity in the built environment, but it is the personal stories that at the end of the day are the most motivating, where I feel the greatest obligation to create change. And I know that's true for many of us. So when we turn to equity and belonging in the built environment, again, I don't have enough time to go deeply into this. That would be a whole other 2-hour plus presentation and exploration with you all. But I did want to bring forward some of the questions that we are asking and that we are encouraging our members to ask. Questions like, whom does this project serve in all the ways that one can think about that? What are the opportunities for ownership? Ownership of the vision, the process, the outcomes, and the economic benefits of this project. How might the people's history of this site and its surroundings, of this land and who lived here, who was forcibly removed, who was barred entry, who was denied ownership, shape this project? I will note that that question is the one that we are asking our members as part of our AIA Minnesota conference going forward to ask and address when they bring forward a project as part of a session. It's our approach that we're experimenting with related to land acknowledgements and trying to take it further than a recognition of the tribal nation, the Native American people whose land was unceded and taken, to recognize it, but also say, how does it shape our thinking today? How does it shape the project today? And to also recognize that there's broader history related to the land in terms of racial covenants and redlining and segregated communities within cities that shape what has been true and what remains true within the cities we serve. And then who sees the built environment as theirs, as something that they can own and shape and benefit from, as opposed to something that is done to them without their interests at heart. Another set of questions that I would suggest to you all that's in the context of our associations is who feels seen, welcomed, and a part of the community, and who doesn't? Who promotes the association to others? Another question, how does the culture of the association vary across groups, across the staff team, the board, particular committees or groups? How well are subcultures aligning with the dominant culture and changes to that dominant culture? What's true across the 5 organizations that I serve as their executive director is that each one has a slightly different culture. And we have worked to develop in this latest round of our strategic plan, a joint approach, a joint plan to further that alignment across these slightly different cultures. And as we change that dominant culture, bring along some of these, for lack of a better term, subcultures. There are pockets of what I would say are sort of holdouts or pockets of resistance to some of the changes that we've cultivated. And it's just taking more time to understand why that resistance exists and how to understand it and how to move on and move forward together. The idea of whose stories do we know and do we repeat, and whose stories are unknown. What is it like to attend an association event? Does it feel different depending on different aspects of who you are? I will say in the context of the College of Fellows and the gatherings that we hold of our fellows at our annual conference and at other places, over the last few years, we have had more and more women and people of color who have earned their and been recognized with fellowship in the AIA. Those gatherings still seem very similar to how they have been for many, many years. And I often see people who are underrepresented within that group come to one meeting and not come again. And so we've got some work to do related to those events, how they feel, and who feels a sense of belonging within that context. Who has an outsized impact on the association culture and why? Who are the folks that receive deference? Who are the folks who are listened to more than others? Who are the folks who are demanding to be listened to more than others? And where does that power come from? And then what damage has been done in the past by the association and its leaders and members, and what repair is warranted? One of the things that we do, and I'll talk a little bit more about our relationship with our local NOMA chapter in a moment, but recognizing that NOMA was created, as I understand it, because people of color, in particular, Black architects, did not feel welcomed, did not feel any sense of belonging, were actively shunned by AIA as an organization. And so with that history, we have taken an approach that NOMA members receive the same member rate as AIA members for our events. And that's across all of the events that we do. That's just one small step of repair in the context of our history as an organization and the culture that's been built. I want to just pause a moment before I dig into AIA Minnesota and our particular path over the last 7-8 years. Any questions or thoughts that arise for you from that last section? We'll just take 2 or 3 comments if you have them, and if you don't, that's fine. We can move on as well.
And Ginger, your hand's up. I think it's been up for a while, but I'm gonna throw it over to you if you want to speak. Oh, Ginger's hand went down. No issue. Anyone wish to jump in here? So the comment is no questions, just note that this presentation is great. Three,
Okay.
whatever those are.
Oh, good. I assume they're positive. So I'm gonna positive emojis of some sort. I'm gonna move on then to digging into our particular story. All right. So one of the things that is true is that AIA Minnesota has received several recognitions at the national level for our work on equity in the profession and in the built environment. We're one of 3 AI components across the country that received the Emerald level designation from the review that was done by consultants with AIA of all of the AIA chapters. We also won an AIA New Urban Agenda Award for something called the 21st Century Development Framework. I'm not going to have time to dig into that framework, but it is something that we worked on with Brian Lee Jr. out of New Orleans and the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota that leverages the 7 petals of the International Living Future Institute to identify the path between standard level development and the best of what's possible, regenerative level development across all of those petals. And we particularly worked on the equity sort of lane of that framework to make it more robust, kind of beyond what the Living Future Institute had initially developed. And that framework was also highlighted recently in an AI national publication, one of 4 frameworks for equitable development that was brought forward. So one way to think about why we would receive those accolades, why we're being lifted up and being encouraged to share our work with other components is to look at our activities and initiatives since 2014. The list is long there, and it actually goes well beyond this, but I'll just very quickly hit a few of these highlights and then move on, because frankly, I think it's less about our activities and initiatives than the thinking that and spirit that we brought to this work. So that speech from Avenue Love Stanley was inspiring to a number of our members. It led to, or it was at least one factor related to the formation of our Women in Architecture Committee in 2014 and a diversity task force. When my predecessor retired after 38 years with the organization, a new job description was written. Obviously, they hadn't needed one for a very long time. And it really emphasized how attention to EDI was going to be core to this role. And frankly, it's one of the main reasons why I applied for the position, because of the more than 10 years of work that I'd done in this space with other associations. And then my first week on the job, the AIA Minnesota board met and adopted a diversity policy that set the goal of reflecting the demographics of the state of Minnesota within the profession of architecture. So when your first mandate upon arriving is in sync with the job description that you've applied based on, it puts wind in your sails and validates that this is core to the organization's future success. The diversity task force that was produced is something that's been shared across the country. It included recommendations from underrepresented members of how the organization could change, as well as how firms could change. A lot of work related to strategic planning and how we approached that brought together a wide variety of members, but in particular, we overrepresented people who have been underrepresented in the profession. Having the people engaged in our work be of the demographics of Minnesota, and to extend it to be the future of the profession and focus a lot of time on student perspectives. We also worked with local leaders to create a NOMA chapter in 2016, get it off the ground, and have sustained that relationship over the years. And we had the entire staff team trained up on intercultural development. This was one of the most consequential things that we did, and it led to many other things to follow that I'll speak to in a moment. We evaluated all of our programs and services against our goals and core values within that new plan, which included equity and inclusion. And I tend not to use the term inclusion. It inherently sort of assumes a hierarchy of one entity or person including someone else, as opposed to belonging. But because EDI is so frequently used, I tend to use that acronym or shorthand. We made changes to our gold medal process. That had been a closed door approach where several FAIAs and a past gold medal winner would sit in a room and say who they thought would be good people to potentially win this award, and then would research it, those individuals, to try to put together the information and make decisions. And we just upended that entirely and made it a much more transparent process with clear criteria. And the changes have resulted in very different demographics of who has achieved that award. We launched something called the Culture Change Initiative. I'll speak to that later. We took our knowledge of intercultural leadership and our own experience and worked with our consultants to develop a program for our members to gain skill in that realm of recognizing and bridging and adapting toward difference. We reviewed and revised all of our awards processes in 2019, hosted the Women's Leadership Summit with a focus on welcome and belonging. As part of that, we established a new fund focused on accelerating women's paths within the profession. We hosted the Close to the Edge Birth of Hip Hop Architecture exhibit in collaboration with community partners. And then in 2020, the murder of George Floyd happened here in Minneapolis. Because we already had a very strong collaborative relationship with NOMA locally and nationally, we were able to respond collaboratively to that tragedy and to the unrest and the impacts on the built environment. Without that relationship established, I don't know how we would have responded. It was absolutely critical to us being able to respond quickly and well. We also launched the National Intercultural Leadership Program. So we took the program that we developed for our members and brought it to a national audience. I think we've now had 14 people from 14 states go through that program. And then we launched in 2021 something called History, Hurdles, and Hope, which is, again, community engagement around the history of the built environment, in particular, when it comes to racial equity and what has gotten in the way of the best of what's possible, where is some bright spots, and that is work that is ongoing right now. And we established a community of practice for culture change, which I'll talk about later as well, and overhauled our magazine to become a digital biweekly and annual, where equity is one of the core content pillars. So every 2 weeks, our members receive new content that speaks specifically to equity in the built environment. And then in 2022, we launched our Equity in the Built Environment Committee. So a group of members really digging into what do we mean when we say this, and what does it mean for the practice of architecture? So the outcomes of all of those activities can be seen in the folks that we bring forward as conference speakers and the topics we cover, in the number and type of leadership positions that are held by people who have long been underrepresented in the architecture community. I really want to emphasize here depth of connection. One of the things that has been most fueling for us is not surface level connections with people who have been underrepresented or marginalized, but depth of connection where we are in real relationship with people to understand what's true for them, to understand what their career aspirations are, which often have nothing to do with the EDI work that we tend to talk about in that way, but to understand what is each person's definition of success and how can the association help them achieve that. Partnerships with the Black community related to the areas affected in the unrest, and then overall just attention to EDI and intercultural competence across all of what we do. One of the other key outcomes relates to our staff team. We are reflective of the Minnesota community in terms of the number of people of color on our staff team. We're a staff team of 10. And we are overrepresented women on our staff team. And we had not done a staff engagement survey or anything that could really tell us with any sort of quantitative data, how are we doing when it comes to people having a feeling of belonging and agency. And I'm sorry that the way that this graph is shown is kind of squeezed and some of the words get cut off, but I think you'll be able to read each of the questions that we asked. We felt good about where we landed as the weighted average of people on a scale of 1 to 10, consistently responding in this high 8s to low 9s realm in terms of feeling that their whole selves are valued, that they have a sense of belonging, that the diversity within our team is leveraged, and that when thoughts are shared, they have the potential to shape the outcomes. That's really about agency, and is that step beyond belonging that is really what drives our organization forward. We also were able to measure the team's growth in intercultural competence. So most of the population, 66%, is in the realm of minimization. And with focus on skill development and there is the ability to grow in recognizing and bridging toward difference, to being able to appreciate differences, and then again in adapting. And our full staff team moved from that category of minimization to in the categories of acceptance and adaptation. We've got several folks in acceptance and several folks in adaptation. So overall, as a staff team, we moved into the high level of acceptance. So how we really got there was a combination of intentionality, commitment, and systems thinking. And what's true is that our culture change initiative research grounded us in systems thinking, but in responding to requests for folks to understand how we had changed the culture of our organization so quickly, we realized that we could apply our systems thinking learnings to our past experience. And we see that the reason why things have happened the way they have is because we actually were using systems thinking without necessarily realizing it at the time. So there's an article that was sent to you in advance, or that I think is going to be posted here, called Systems Thinking for Culture Change. And it was printed in our print annual of Enter, where we introduced readers to some broad concepts around systems thinking. And this approach that we've taken as an organization, both in terms of trying to move the profession forward and in our work as an AIA component. And it really boils down to 3 steps: defining what we're aiming for in terms of the culture of the organization, the culture of the profession, identifying leverage points within the system that are going to move us furthest, fastest, and then cultivating change. So in the context of the profession, we worked with more than 70 members, again, overrepresenting the membership to reflect the demographics of the state, and understood their experiences with the culture that is and has been. And we asked them to talk about what they wanted the culture to be. And as we sort of boiled this all down, we defined the desired culture as one that is authentic, equitable, and collaborative. And you can see here sort of the descriptions of each of those. What's also true is that when I came into the organization, these were the aspects of the culture almost to the letter of what I talked with the board, and we worked together to cultivate in the component as an organization. So that alignment between the culture of the staff team and within the board and what we're working on in a broader sense has been really powerful. We dug into leverage points analysis, which Janella Meadows brought forward decades ago, and found it a really helpful framework for thinking about how do we prioritize where we put our time and effort, and what is likely to move the system, what's likely to create culture change fastest with the least amount of effort. The low-level leverage points are the ones on this screen, and they the one that people tend to focus on in creating change, which actually requires a huge amount of effort in order to move a system, is the stocks that are flowing into a system. In this case, the workforce that's flowing in or leaving the system. But the leverage points where you can put a small amount of effort, make a few changes, and they can have outsized impact, are this realm of information flows. Who has access to what information, at what times, in what sequence? The rules of the system. What behaviors are rewarded, which are discouraged? And this is both the stated and unsaid rules. Who has the power to change what aspects of the system, to change things in real time? The goals of the system, again, both the stated and unstated aims. And very powerfully, the mindsets and paradigms that underlie the beliefs that underlie the rest of the system. It's how we think about the profession. It's how we think about the work of architecture, how we think about the work of the association. And then the ability to see beyond the current system to transcend paradigms. One of the learnings that I want to share here that was a bit of a revelation for us and a hard learning that applied both to our work within the association, but most importantly in the work of changing the culture of the profession, is that while pipeline efforts focused on those stocks flowing into the system are crucial, they are not enough to move the system fast enough. We have to change ourselves. We have to change the culture of the institutions we've built and that we sustain. We know this is true in the context of gender. The fact that the gender balance of people in architecture schools tends to reflect that of the broader population, but 7 years in, the number of women that remain in quote unquote traditional architecture practice goes down dramatically. So changing the numbers flowing into the system is not enough to create culture change. There are counterbalancing forces that undercut those outcomes, and that also then stifles recruitment, because when folks cannot see themselves within the practicing community, they don't necessarily pursue it or they don't stay within it. Also, what's true about K-12 work and recruitment at colleges, it is arm's length work that doesn't require culture change. And it is the most often cited sort of excuse, frankly, that I hear from firm leaders is, well, we just don't have enough people in the pipeline to bring them into our firm. But if we aren't creating environments, creating cultures where everyone has a strong chance to thrive, we are operating without integrity. To invite people in, to recruit them into a situation that we have not prepared for their success is a real violation of that value of integrity. So again, what's true for our work in trying to change the culture of the profession and has been true in our work within our chapter is to change the culture by focusing on mindsets, growing self-awareness around existing mindsets at the individual and organizational level, determining the desired mindsets, what we're aiming for, and then spotting patterns of where mindsets are showing up in the system. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One mindset pair that we identified was one where on balance, it would hinder our progress toward that desired culture, is the mindset that people who work in architecture are most successful when they tamp down or hide expression of their gender, culture, or sexual orientation if they are not white heterosexual men. That feminine expression means people will not take you seriously, and if you are a blank slate, clients will trust you to bring their vision to life. The paired mindset that on balance we determined would accelerate the desired culture is that the work of architecture is best accomplished when we can bring our whole selves to our work. That the expression of diverse perspectives, life experiences, and cultures needs to be supported for the best in creativity and problem solving, the best in design outcomes to be realized. Another mindset pair that we identified in the profession relates to the idea of the individual achievement versus collaboration. The mindset that we identified as hindering the desired culture is one where individual achievement is primary, the hero architect mindset, and that the pursuit of legacy is noble and individualistic in nature. The paired mindset that on balance we see as accelerating the desired culture is that collaboration is primary, that credit and legacy are team-based, and that team includes all involved in the work. So I want to pause for a moment, and I know that was a long stretch before engaging with you all, but I wanted to ask where you might see this particular hindering mindset of the hero architect and individual achievement showing up in your firm or showing up in your AIA component. And again, we'll just take a couple of responses to this one.
Casey Wong.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Hopefully people can hear me. I just wanted to add that I definitely see this a lot, not only like in school, but also just in the profession. I think the issues that how just society tends to really put people on a pedestal, for example, star architects and stuff. And so I think a lot of firms and even architects, even though sometimes good intentions, right, have this notion to really put themselves on that pedestal to think that they're better than everyone else. And then as a result, all the things that you're talking about, communities become disengaged. They feel like they can't be part of it. They feel like they can't enter into the profession. It's just this whole entire thing. And for me, it's like, I see it in my AIA chapter in Central Valley, like there's good intentions. People do want to do the right thing. They're understanding, but I think it's just like, instead of just saying it, is there that deeper action to actually back this up, right? And so even when we talk about collaboration, what do we mean by collaboration? Does everyone's voice actually matter? And so I think it's really funny because I also work with high school students. And so when I even say collaboration, I love when they tell me, it's like, what do you mean by that, right? Because we throw these words around all the time, but do we actually teach people the tools to actually work together and actually know how to resolve conflict and even address conflict, right? So I think like usually we're just very conflict avoidant. We generally tend to be conflict avoidant. So I think this is just great. So yeah, just want to share my 2 cents there. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's something that I've come to understand as not being unique to Minnesota culture. Minnesota culture is famously conflict avoidant. It is ridiculous. We are known for being passive aggressive and yeah, it's a problem. But it's not just confined to the boundaries of Minnesota. It is something that also shows up a lot in this profession. And the one of the findings that we had from a previous research study more broadly in the AEC industry is that architects want to be viewed as collaborators. They see themselves as collaborative. But when you ask others in the AEC industry if architects are collaborative, they definitely don't think that y'all are. And they really yearn for that they really want to have a more collaborative relationship with architects. So there's a gap there between intention and self-perception and reality, or at least the perception of others. So I love that you're engaging with high school students who are asking the best obvious questions. And I will tell you from a collaborative relationship that I'm in with a community leader, that getting shared meaning around some of this terminology is so important. When you say, let's collaborate to make this happen, you actually have to, dig into what that means for each person, each organization. The particular thing that we got caught up on was differences in interpreting what a policy agenda is. It's a particular thing in her neighborhood organization context and something totally different in mine. And so when we're working across difference and there's and sort of out of sync, it can sometimes be around those very basic concepts and needing to take the time to really get on the same page and then be able to move forward together.
Mary-Margaret, I'd be remiss if I didn't just throw this in, but when you're going for your fellowship, it's all about you. And if architecture is a collaborative exploit, you know, that's a conflict right there. So
it is one of my favorite examples, and I'm glad you brought it forward. It's something that I have talked with some of the fellows who are really well connected in the College of Fellows and have been advocating for there to be at least some sort of addition to, if we can't change the whole thing overnight, to at least allow for and encourage some sort of statement around how you have been a strong collaborator in your work, right? But the idea of casting your whole history that you've been working in teams and as a collaborator to be through individual achievement is really painful for a lot of people, and it's false in a lot of ways, and obviously reinforces this mindset, but it also leads really well-deserving people to not apply for fellowship, just rejecting that idea entirely. So yeah.
Jeff Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. So the issue that I find, I thought it was just a designer thing, you know, and this idea of control and credit, that it's mine. And every idea I have is precious and I need to protect it. So I think that for me took a while to get over, because even in college, as we're trained to be, it's our things and it's competitive. I was told when I first got into school, look to your right, look to your left. Only 1 out of 10 of you is going to become an architect. It's like, what kind of precedence does that set?
Yeah.
Well, it sets up that it's mine, and I'm going to compete, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to protect it. So it took me a while as I start to mature. Is we're stronger together. That my perspective is only my, you know, hindsight and prejudice. To understand someone's other perspective gives me a different viewpoint of looking at something a little more truthfully.
Yeah.
But, you know, even as I say I want to be a collaborator, if my mindset in my practice doesn't allow me to behave that way, you know, I can talk how I want to.
Yeah.
So it really took a while, an intentional thing to, am I more interested in other people's success more than my own?
Mm-hmm.
And that took a while to be willing to give up and to give things. No, people would succeed with the information I gave them more than I did. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So that hero thing, there's a lot to unpack in that. But it's a behavioral thing and it's a culture shift. So once I started to behave that way, where I could give stuff up, hoping that they would succeed more than me, man, it changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then people say, oh yeah, well, okay, I'm willing to put my stuff in. Now you start to build on each other's successes.
Yeah.
And so there's one process that was helpful for me. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with design thinking out of the D School at Stanford. It starts out with empathy, of a deep understanding and listening and understanding of the client or user or whoever that is. It was helpful for me that there is a process, and but the deeper thing is the awareness. Is like, do you know how you work? Are you really a collaborator? Are you really interested in other people more than yourself? So anyway, great discussion. I really appreciate all this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one resource I want to point you all toward is a very new chapter of the Guides for Equitable Practice that's focused on academia and schools of architecture. And it really challenges a lot of the conventional thinking. It's excellent. And I think it's a good one for folks to read because it brings you back into that territory. And if you're adjunct or know people who are, or if you're someone who teaches within architecture schools full time, it's something to dig into and bring forward as a conversation starter and hopefully more than that. Yeah, there's a lot we could dig into there, but absolutely true. All right, I'm going to move on. Just trying to be conscious of the time. So one of the documents that, if I've not sent it along to Nikki already, I will, is I think it's 3 or 4 pages full of these mindset pairs that we identified in our research. And at the end of it, there's also a section where we have analyzed it to try to understand what are the fundamental fears that underlie those mindsets. So if this has been interesting to you, I encourage you to dig into that document as well. One of the things that I thought about in preparing to talk to you today is what were the mindsets and the mindset shifts that really accelerated our culture change within AIA Minnesota as an organization. So really coming back to this association perspective. The pairs that I identified were moving away from a mindset that trust and respect need to be earned, to instead lead with the idea that we trust first and we respect everyone. And to also employ the platinum rule here, that what trust and respect look like to me may be different than what they look and feel like to someone else. Moving away from a mindset that we serve firms and firm leaders primarily, to one where we serve each individual member and potential member, that we serve the architecture community, which is a more inclusive term than saying we serve architects. When we've got so many associate AI members, when we've got allied members and emeritus members, we need a term that serves the whole. And that's why you'll hear me say architecture community most often. And again, this idea that as an individual membership organization, our focus needs to be on each individual member's personal definition of success. And how do we facilitate that? How do we remove or mitigate the barriers that individuals encounter in trying to achieve that definition of success? Moving away from a mindset of orientation rooted in the past and in tradition toward one that is oriented toward the future. Moving away from restrictive, fixed pie, and opaque mindsets toward openness, expansiveness, and transparency. Moving away from individualistic and competitive mindsets toward team-based and collaboration. And then moving away from reinforcing what we hold in common toward recognizing differences and realizing repair related to those differences. We then applied that focus on the mindsets that we're aiming for in the context of a variety of those high impact leverage points. So the stated and unstated goals of the organization, to have alignment between our state and local priorities on equity and climate action, and have that also be the 2 goals of AIA, is a really powerful alignment and has been very helpful to our efforts. And that we have a shared strategic work plan, shared priorities and objectives and core values across all of our chapters in Minnesota. That is made easier by the fact that we are all one staff team serving all of those chapters, but it wasn't always the case and has been really helpful to have that alignment. I'm going to talk more about power in just a moment, but we have also focused on who has the power, who is trusted to make decisions in real time, to shape outcomes, and asking that question in the context of the staff team, volunteer leaders, and the community members that we're engaged with. The rules, what's rewarded and what's discouraged. Again, that work related to awards criteria and eligibility, opening that up. And in the staff team context and with volunteer leaders, rewarding both accomplishments and the learnings that come from taking risks that don't always pan out as we might expect, rewarding growth mindsets. and discouraging and addressing behavior that undercuts the desired culture and undercuts our EDI goals, holding people accountable. And then finally, information flows. Again, more transparency related to our awards process, related to leadership opportunities, and pursuing a just label. We are just one criteria away, one wellness plan away from submitting our just label and feeling really good about bringing that forward to everyone. We also recognize that we each hold and can leverage all types of power, that it's not just positional power that matters, especially in a context of embracing adaptive leadership. So across all of the various positions that people hold related to AIA Minnesota and the local chapters and the foundation, each of us also holds relational power. The people that we are close to, the people that we influence, the people that rely on our guidance and our perspective. We each also hold the ability to reward certain behaviors or to discourage other behaviors in the ways that we interact with each other and in the policies that we have. But again, just the personal power we hold is in often the conversations we have and the questions we ask. And we each also have expert power, and that can take the form of specialized knowledge or skill that relates to EDI, that relates to our shared goals, but also can be in the form of our lived experience. We are each of us expert in what our lives have been, how they have unfolded, what we have witnessed. Power is often thought of in a negative, and it is actually neutral in nature. It's about how it is used, how it is wielded. It also can be under-recognized and underutilized, and that in and of itself is a form of abuse of power. One of the things that has been true for me in my own leadership journey is there was a time when I really tried to almost disown my positional power and just say, I'm just one of you. You know, I may hold this title, but I'm just part of the team. And in doing that, I undervalued and under-recognized just how powerful any conversation I have has. The extra emphasis that people put on the words I say and the questions that I ask. What's also true here is that, especially when we're talking about equity in the built environment, that there is experience and expertise that people within a particular team likely lack when they're working with community. And when that's true, you know, to be self-aware about that and develop partnerships with people who have the perspectives, have the relationships in community that you lack. In these last few minutes, I just want to hit on some very specific next steps. Now, again, I'm not a fan of the checklist, but I do have some ideas of where you might start in trying to apply some of the things we've talked about today. So, number one, I want you to stop doing something. I want everyone to stop sharing their stories of long hours and sacrifice. Often these are shared in a context of advocating for a better culture in the profession. But when you're talking with young people in the profession, when you're talking with students about how, oh man, I remember architecture school, I remember studio where I stayed up 3 nights in a row. Oh, it was just terrible. And it should never be like that again. What you're actually doing is reinforcing that culture as attached to you as someone who has been successful in the profession. So this is something to just realize the impact that even perpetuating those stories can have on that mindset being perpetuated in the culture. Again, in that spirit, in that embracing of more adaptive leadership approaches, more transformational leadership approaches, recognize that we're dealing here more with cultivation than we are with checklists. We're dealing more with adaptive challenges. So if we think about it as cultivation, we can employ complexity theory, which is kind of under the umbrella of systems thinking, where we seed, nurture, weed, and harvest change. So in the context of the profession, seeding is about inspiring young people to come into the field, bringing in new employees and collaborators, encouraging new thinking. Nurturing is about those conditions within a firm or a workplace that prepares the supports and resources that a variety of people need in order to thrive. There's the idea of regularly questioning assumptions and ways of doing things and shining a light on efforts that are having the desired impact. Weeding is about creating space and holding people accountable for their impact on the culture. And harvesting is about measuring, about assessing outcomes and comparing intentions to impact. So in terms of your specific next steps that you could take, one is simply to ask new questions. And throughout this presentation, I brought forward a variety of questions that you can ask yourself, that you can ask within your team, that you can ask related to the projects that you work on in community. You can also establish new relationships that are not represented currently in your circle of influence. So if you don't personally know any current students of architecture, there are whether there are students who are sitting on your boards of directors or are heading local NOMAS or AIS chapters, invite them out for coffee, get together with them on a quarterly basis, get to truly know them, to be able to hold their stories in your head and have it influence your thinking. When it comes to reaching out to people who are underrepresented in the profession, if your goal is to bring more perspectives into your committees or your board of directors, there's an article that I sent along to Nikki and the team that gives perspective on how to do so in a way that does not make people feel tokenized, that really recognizes people as whole selves whose goals may be entirely different than EDI related. And I recommend that article to you. Also think about being in relationship with people who have quote unquote left the profession. The fact that we have so narrowly defined what it means to be a practicing architect means that there are an ever narrowing number of people who see themselves as part of this architecture community, feel a sense of belonging. So actively reach out to some people who are applying their architectural skills and knowledge in different ways to have their experience and perspectives inform your own. You can also share some of the ideas that you heard today. You can do this specifically by picking one or two of those mindset pairs and engaging others in your group, in your firm, to pattern spot how those mindsets are showing up, and then talk about what you observe. You can also leverage specific moments that are happening within the cycle of your firm or your workplace to learn and experiment. So if you're about to hire someone, dig into the guides for equitable practice that relate to hiring practices. If it's you're gearing up for performance evaluations on an annual basis, if that's how you continue to do things, look at that guidance related to performance evaluation. And also look at the Center for Work-Life Law's bias interrupters that are related to that elephant in the well-designed room report. And also, this is a particular thought experiment that I started doing when I worked for the Hennepin County Bar so lawyers and judges, when I passed someone in one of our skyways that connects buildings in downtown Minneapolis and did not recognize this member, they were dressed down, quote unquote. They were, going off to a meeting with a nonprofit organization, and my filter was filtering them out from being one of my members, because they typically would show up in suits on the regular when I would meet with them. Because there's such a bias toward who looks like an architect, talks like an architect, thinks like an architect, I did the same sort of thought experiment that I'll describe to you. I spent a few hours just walking through my community and thinking about every single person I saw, regardless of their age, regardless of anything else related to their persona or how they came across, as someone who is a licensed architect, someone who was trained in architecture, or someone who was aspiring to be an architect. And it's amazing how you recognize how much your brain is filtering who belongs and who doesn't within that community. So just one very specific suggestion. When it comes to nurturing, in addition to meeting new people, I encourage you to reach out to people who you know to some degree, but who you would like to know better, and who you can deepen your relationships with, and people who are different from you in one way or another. Again, taking that one-to-one spirit of depth of understanding. Also, identify who in your world is exhibiting that culture that you're aiming for, and invite them to opportunity to get to know them better. Weeding. A step you can take is to review your current accountability measures or establish new ones in the context of the performance evaluations. What level of priority is placed on someone's impact on the culture, whether positively or negatively? Do you recognize supervisors' outsized impact on the experience that a person has, their impact on the culture and on retention? And do you see evidence of rainmakers and celebrated designers being held to different standards of accountability? And ask the question, if they were new hires, would their behavior be tolerated? And then finally, harvesting. The employee survey that I referenced and the questions that we asked there, those are questions that you can ask in the context of the staff team of your component or your firm, and even maybe something to think about within your board of directors or among your volunteer leaders. The last invitation I want to put out to you is that the Community of Practice for Culture Change is a group that meets every other month, and we regularly get together for conversation about creating culture change. It's a facilitated discussion. We've got about 60 people from around the country who participate. We hold the same meeting twice to make it work for various people's schedules. But just know that by virtue of you listening to this presentation today, you are very welcome to be a part of this if that authentic, equitable, collaborative culture is one that you would like to create in the world. Last few thoughts. I encourage you to recognize your power to lead from wherever you are and to lead with integrity. And I really hold on to this quote from Maya Angelou in terms of integrity, to do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And I'm hoping that you know a little bit more on the other side of this presentation, and it will fuel you to do better in the world. My last slide, this is how I think about equity in the profession, in our associations, and in the built environment. That if we can move away from this idea of sort of fixed pie where we're competing for resources, and that if one group gains, the other loses, if we think more expansively that there is room for everyone, that everyone's contributions can take us to places we've never been, to realize the best of what's possible. That mindset shift alone can take us where we need to go.